kidding.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. Welcome to our live stream on climate justice. I'm Afi Tengue. My pronouns are she, her. I'm the VP of Philanthropy and Impact at Giving Compass. And joining me today is Ashindi Maxton, the Executive Director of Donors of Color Network. Welcome, Ashindi.
Thanks, Afi.
So a little background for today's discussion. Climate justice focuses on building economic and political power in the communities that have felt the disproportionate impact of climate change and inequitable policies that have led to issues like pollution. We're at a critical moment where investing in BIPOC-led organizations, those most proximate to the problems, can help advance system change. In this live stream, we're going to discuss the effects of climate change on affected communities, what climate justice solutions look like, and how donors can take action now. Ashindi, before we get started, can you please share a bit about yourself and Donors of Color Network?
Sure. So I'm Ashindi, the Afi fan, first of all, and then second, have been doing philanthropy for about the last 16 years, mostly as an advisor to different donor networks, building strategies and collaboratives like New Media Ventures, like the Youth Engagement Fund, like the Emergent Fund, all things that I sort of helped architect from early stages. And at some point after all this time in philanthropy, doing a lot of racial justice work, realized it would be amazing to have more of a home that involved people of color on the decision-making side of philanthropic decisions. Got lucky enough to meet two colleagues, Urvashi Vad and Holly Lee, who were asking the same questions. And we did 3 years of research about donors of color in particular. And our research ended us at a place of saying, no one has yet built the home for high net worth donors of color that they are telling us they wish existed. So we built Donors of Color really as a place to bring together people who have resources, influence, lived experience as people of color, and who were really committed to systemic racial justice and to using their influence together. And the climate campaign is a really good example of, sort of a first out of the lineup thing that we realized we could do together as a community that none of us could do alone.
Awesome. So let's talk about climate change. Who has been most affected by it and what kind of conditions has it created?
Mm-hmm. I will say the very first time that we ever stood in front of the people who became the Donors of Color Network, we put up a slide that showed Hurricane Katrina, and then another slide that showed Hurricane Maria. And the heading you should have in your head to those images is people of color are the front face of climate change and climate crisis in particular. So there's, we're past the point of denial that climate is changing. We are living it. We're living it in wildfires in California. We're living it in flooding in Texas. We're living it in snowstorms in Dallas. We're living it in hurricanes. We're living it in drought. We're living it in locusts. And the people who are in the most marginalized positions are the people who are suffering the most. And really the other way to see that is they are the people who have the most at stake in getting this right. And, as those of us who think about funding need to see that the people who have the most stake in getting climate, in averting climate crisis, in changing the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere that is changing the weather patterns, that we need to be a part of the conversation. And so, because our organizations that represent our communities are so under-resourced, we haven't shown up at scale, we haven't had a voice, and that's a part of why the climate movement is failing in many ways.
Yeah, I think there's something about proximity that it persists across all parts of philanthropy and all parts of social change, like understanding the intersections and understanding that the narrative of liberation is always going to be those, like, it's more likely to be successful if it comes from the communities who are experiencing the disadvantage and disenfranchisement. So I think it's deeply exciting that you all are embarking upon this. And that 1.3% statistic of dollars that are going to BIPOC-led organizations in the environmental justice movement is terrifying and also not surprising when we think about, again, like how little we have achieved at this moment when it comes to climate justice. So moving to the next question, like we keep hearing climate justice, quote unquote. What do climate justice solutions look like and who is leading them?
Mm-hmm. First, I want to center on that 1.3% stat. So
let's take a step back. Yeah.
1.3% of climate funding, according to one study, which is so far the best study we have, going to organizations led by people of color. It's stunning. We come across statistics like this pretty often, like they generate in philanthropy, like those of us who do it, it's like the appalling shocking and yet predictable statistic of how little money flows to communities of color from philanthropy is it reflects the field. And so I just wanted to pause here and say how important it is again that you change the face of the people who are making decisions in philanthropy, and that people who are in decision-making positions reflect very deeply on what practices are entrenched that are keeping them from reaching their goals. So to go back to the question about climate justice, I think it's a really good question, because some people have confused it a bit with environmental justice, and the idea that there is a whole field that is built, around people of color organizing in their communities around climate crisis, toxic chemicals, things that are existing in their communities, and that there's a whole field, there is a whole set of superstars, a whole set of important work that has happened, in the environmental justice movement. And sort of, if you work in climate world, like, it's EJ, and
Yeah.
folks know it. And it's important that, we did not call this the Environmental Justice Funders Pledge. Like, this work that we're doing was actually meant to encompass something much broader than that. So that inclusive, like, we want to grow the field of environmental justice. Climate justice to us looks like equity in funding. It looks like equity across the board. It looks like everyone resourced to play their part in the story that impacts all of us. That's the most pressing issue facing humanity. And so we are taking a stand from where we are. To us, climate justice looks like, from where we are, at least 30% of resources moving to organizations led by and accountable to communities of color. And that could be across the board. That could be in a lab. That could be thinking about climate policy. That could be programs that are about equitable distribution of electric vehicles. It could be about mass transit routes. There are a million ways to enter, what we think climate justice looks like. So it's very important to us, because a lot of the first conversations we had with foundation leaders were, look, we are like rigorous about reducing the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere to avert climate crisis. And, we don't fund organizing to do that. And our answer is, well, what makes you think that people of color can only organize?
Yeah.
And second, if you don't fund organizing, how do you think you are going to get the political will and power that you need to pass the bold legislation that we need to reduce the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest shortcomings of philanthropy is not is an expectation of results within 6 months, within 3 months, within 12 months, and seeing something tangible. Like, what is it that you're going? I think they think of it as an investment where they get a return, and it's not about the humanity or the reality of, like, this is relationship building, it's trust building, it's community building, and it's a movement, and that takes time, and it's not something you're going to count, and it's not a report you're going to get back. It's a long-term situation, like what we saw in Georgia, like 10, 20 years of organizing to get to a pivotal moment of change. Like, and I talk about it on every webinar. I'm like, let's talk about the importance of long-term capacity building and supporting C4 dollars and getting the work done in the future, right? Yeah, and I also think, like, when you talked about what it looks like is equity and funding, like in that 30%, for me, like, we have to continue to hold center a redistribution of resources and seeding decision making, handing it over to communities, and, like, letting go of the power that is attached to whatever wealth based upon whatever system and structures that have supported your privilege of getting to a point of being at having capacity to give, like, actually handing that over. I think the Aligned Funders opportunity that is with Donors of Color Network is a great way for a lot of wealthy individuals. Again, more than 80% of wealth sits within white families and communities. And if they actually want to align with communities of color and doing this work and leading this work and narrating their own solutions, like, you see decision making, you hand the dollars over to a trustworthy source that vets, curates, and works with organizers, again, supporting the collective liberation that we can all find joy in, right? Like, that's the future we're looking for and hoping for. So let's talk.
Before you move on and ask me another question, can I just react to that?
Yeah.
You have so many fertile things to say. You can't just let them lie. I would say this thing about ceding decision-making power, there are half steps to that too. Like, it's not all anything. One half step is acknowledging, I think just having philanthropy, like, take a step back and acknowledge the idea that we think we have better solutions than communities have. Just sit,
amen to that. Yeah.
just sit deeply with that idea of, why would I, in my conference room, with potted plants and lovely pictures on the wall, like
Views of
that.
the water, the mountains,
Yes, think that
lawns.
I have the better ability to make decisions for those communities than they have for themselves. And I think just sitting with that before you go all the way into like turning your decision making over, why do you believe that you are better positioned to solve climate crisis than those communities are? And it is very much built in white supremacy, and that's just an acknowledgement to like sit with, and then sit with information. Like the 97% of the world's biodiversity is in indigenous held land. That's not accidental. You could fact check me on the 97%, but it's like a massive percentage.
Yeah.
That's not accidental. Like they know how to curate the biodiversity of their world, right? Like in a way that like other people haven't. So like just refusing to see that expertise is a part of how we're not getting to solutions. So I think really deeply believing, that there are solutions that we cannot see if these communities aren't engaged is a part of how you get to like understanding why you want to give your decision making power to other folks. And I will say that at Donors of Color, we have fellow travelers who are climate leaders who have advised this campaign from inception forward. And it's a really important thing for me to call out, that we have not taken a step without our climate movement leaders.
Yeah. Okay, next question. So let's talk a bit more about the pledge, the Donors of Color's Climate Funders Justice Pledge. What is it? What is your goal? Who has taken it? And I will say, because I spent time on the page, like why have you been so transparent on who hasn't signed it, why people haven't signed it, and who just has not responded? Like let's have an honest conversation about that and why that was the presentation.
Right. Well, so I'm, going back to why Donors of Color was brought into existence, we knew that our lived experience really mattered. And then, we chose to organize high net worth folks. And, that was because we understood, one, that there are a lot of resources kind of trapped up at the top of the economy that we wanted to, be able to organize each other around. And second, was because we understood there's influence and networks that, this group of people have. So when we thought, what is the most powerful intervention we can make as a community around climate crisis, and our amazing climate strategist, Danielle Dean, Ryan, who could not be more brilliant, who was really the architect of this whole campaign, when, she worked with our climate working group of members to say like, what is this, how could we respond to this 1.3% number? Like that was the starting point, was Danielle bringing to us, this 1.3% number, having us react to it, and then us saying, well, we are also funders. Like, what could it look like for us to challenge the field, and to come to the field as peers and say, we think equity when it lands in a budget looks like this.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think? And
Yeah.
and if you don't have a better answer, we're open. Like the first ask out of the Climate Justice Funders Pledge was actually just for a conversation. Like, and one of our questions was like, do you think 1.3% will get us there? Do you think that sounds like a winning movement? And if
Yeah.
you don't think it sounds like a winning movement, what are you willing to do, like both inside of your own institution, but also as a model to the field, to have a truth and reconciliation moment around the ways you have not funded these organizations? And so to us, it looked like two things. We chose 30% as the number of, that we are challenging people to sign on to, or inviting people to sign on to, and to say we're going to move at least 30% of our resources to organizations led by, accountable to communities of color, and with a specific racial justice orientation in their work. It's a pretty rigorous definition.
Yeah.
And because we really wanted people to be thinking about race, like you could definitely have like an organization led by people of color that wasn't thinking about racial justice. So, we started with 30%. The way we got to the 30% number was actually from some other work we had done, where we realized it was an achievable number, that it was ambitious, but it was also achievable. Ideally, you'd be reflective, like we would be reflecting the percentage of people of color in the population, which is closer to 40%. So, but start at 30, get there, from 1.3%, that's ambitious, but it's achievable. And then the second part of the pledge is transparency, which is really about data collection. So we ask all of the foundations who are signing on to report their data. And that's because we measure what we care about. And people weren't measuring this. Like we saw person after person like measure, like tell us their statistic of people of color they were funding as a, as the numerator and the denominator being their US based climate funding. They did it in front of us for the first time. They had never done it. And so Danielle, our climate strategist, likes to say, like, at least know your number.
Yeah.
At least know your number. And we had one very big funder who initially agreed to sign the pledge, then calculated their number in front of us, realized their number was zero,
Sweet Jesus.
and then
Okay.
and it had to do with the fact that a lot of their portfolio was international, but still, like, it was like the fact that a lot of your portfolio is international means you can fix your denominator of US based funding with like one large grant, but you're choosing not to do that. So at least getting people to focus on the data, we thought was powerful, and then getting to agree to measure it year after year, like through the candidate reporter program. So we're not trying to be, in the middle of the measurements, but everyone's using, as standard a measurement as possible. And I want to take one moment on the data because that's often like where people get stuck of
Yeah.
like, how do we get this data? And there's two things I say to that. Like, one is, if you are asking an organization you fund whether or not they are majority people of color in leadership and whether they have a commitment to racial justice, and they can't answer that question in a 30-second phone call,
Yeah.
you actually know the answer. So that's one, and then two, people think about intermediaries, and we're like really thinking through the answer there. But one of them is like, get your intermediaries to sign the pledge. Box checked, like, so if you're using intermediaries to do your funding, there's that. And then the third is international funding. And we think that is just really on a different trajectory, but like the pledge should apply in some ways internationally, because it's also not as though marginalized communities are being funded internationally or that the global South is being funded equitably, to address climate crisis. But, there are other people who are thinking about taking on that part of the puzzle.
Yeah, I want to go back to the accountability to community. I think it's something that is a glaring chasm in the philanthropic sector of actually being accountable to community. And you're talking about data, but what does it mean and what does it look like to be accountable to community? When you think about when it comes to this pledge and it comes to this work, what does that look like? Because I think people hear accountability, but they can't visualize it. And I just want to be sure that we articulate it here.
Yeah, for us, we say it's an explicitly stated commitment to racial justice. Like that's what we ask for in the pledge, to equity, that you are thinking about equity in the work you do. And then we ask for a majority of your board of directors and your leader to be people of color. So to us, that's accountability because you've created a power dynamic in which people of color have the decision-making power. So that's as far as, we have gone in trying to define it for other folks. But there's obviously layers and layers here, that you could explore. Like, what does it mean to be accountable? And I'll say again, for us at Donors of Color, like another way that we try to maintain our accountability is, our collective giving vehicle at Donors of Color is called the Power Fund. And on that Power Fund, I don't get a vote. If somebody writes a check to Donors of Color to give away, the Power Fund Advisory Council gives it away and or approves the recommendation that has been made. And they are 6 movement leaders and 4 donor leaders. And the 6 movement leaders, like, this is what they do. That they are in and out of communities of color, like working with the most marginalized people all day long, and that is the perspective that gets the majority vote of where we spend our resources.
Right. Okay, the next question, we were just talking about power building. You all advocate for funding BIPOC-led power building groups. What kinds of organizations fall into this category, and what kind of work do they do?
Yeah, when we built Donors of Color, one of the sort of core values was that we wanted to be explicit about building power. And this is because we felt like the opportunity in front of us was to shift systems, and you shift systems by changing power. And if you've read like any of Ibram Kendi's work, it's really about the fact that like you can kind of change hearts and minds, but that's not where shift really happens. Like shift happens when people of color get power, and then the hearts and minds change. So, like thinking about like people of color in elected office, thinking about people of color in decision-making positions and foundations, like, that is the kind of thing that we are, really trying to be oriented to make systemic change. So power building organizations, like if that is the lens that you're considering, is something that is showing up in and out of cycle. For example, if you care about civic engagement, like it's not an organization that shows up in the middle of an election cycle. Like what happened in Georgia this year? Like if you cared about democracy, you had to care about the runoff election in Georgia.
Yeah.
doesn't matter how, like, if you're partisan or not, like if you just cared about democracy and
Very concept
changing
of
power,
democracy.
the
Yes.
very concept of democracy, if you cared, you needed to care about the runoff in Georgia. And at the point that that runoff in Georgia happened, it was too late to really do a lot. So what really mattered was the investments that got made earlier than that in power building groups
Yep.
like New Georgia Project, which is there in and out of cycle talking to groups like Fair Fight, which is Stacey Abrams' organization, which is like working to fight back, the voter suppression laws. In Texas, it's a group like the Texas Organizing Project. We support advanced Native political leadership for at Donors of Color. There's or groups that do culture work like Culture Strike, I think or the Center for Cultural Organizing, Cultural Power, Center for Cultural Power and Organizing. So there are all different ways to build power. But what it looks like to us is like you're working in those communities in and out of cycle, like to build their ability to have agency in the decisions that affect their lives in and out of a moment in which everybody else cares.
Yeah. Yeah, we're coming to the last few minutes, so I won't dive into the in and out of cycle because I just want to write like a whole book about in and out of cycle and how we like take it all apart. But the next question is, what are you hearing from your donors network about climate justice? Do they mention barriers or success stories?
Mm-hmm. Our donors are primarily engaging in the climate work through our climate pledge, right? And so it is like the role that they are having looks like being the ones who are talking to foundation presidents. Like we meet with foundation presidents or leadership almost every day right now. Like the Climate Funders Pledge is a massive organizing campaign. So our members are really, they're taking some of those meetings. They are, opening their networks to us. Like they're making introductions to the places where they can help us get inside the door to foundations who might otherwise not have listened to us. So I think there's just incredible enthusiasm for like seeing the motion that has happened. There was an article that came out yesterday in the Nonprofit Times where the Pisces Foundation was like, we're increased, like, because of this pledge, we're increasing our grant making by 50%, and like, that's millions of dollars, like the actual anticipated number. There's about $1 billion in climate grant making that happens each year. And so our anticipation is that like if we're mildly successful in this pledge, just partially successful, it will be $100 million in new resources going to organizations led by and accountable to communities of color. And we believe that will have transformative impact on the climate movement. We genuinely believe it. So our donors, I think, believe that with us, created the campaign in which we said, like, that is the goal that we are setting for ourselves, to do something really catalytic. And so they're standing behind it that way. And a question you asked me earlier that I forgot to answer was about calling people out. And, this is one of the great things about having, an independent donor network, which is that, there aren't very many people who can stand independent enough of these foundations to do that. And so again, first wave was absolute invitation. Like we, really believe that people have the best intentions. We all make mistakes. I mean, this 1.3% one was a big one, but like we are inviting everyone to say like, and there are people who are already doing it so much better. And also that number might be off, but let's say it's off by a factor of 10. It's still so bad. It's still so bad. So, I think like, the first round really has been like, we're looking for allies. Like we believe people have good intentions. We have not met anyone who thinks that 1.3% number is acceptable. And so, we really do want to help people get to that lever, and again, to issue the challenge of like, you can model for the field. You can have a moment in which you maybe look bad by reporting your data, but then understand that everyone's naked out here. Because, like nobody's doing great. Or you can like opt out and, not take part in this moment, but then we're interested in what you do choose to do. Because if you're telling us that this is like, you want to solve climate crisis and you don't think we can do it without doing this piece of the work, then we do want to call you out. Then we want it recorded, that like you chose not to. And, so we're just using the, the things at our disposal to say like, hey, here are the people who are trying really to do the best they can. And we've also, added asterisks where people asked us to be like, we opted out because we do mostly international funding. Like, okay, that's legit, for whatever reasons people said, but like where people really just weren't responsive, we just, we're letting folks know.
Yeah. So as we're winding down, my very last question for our individual donors in the audience, like what can they be doing to support climate justice solutions? I think we hear climate change and we hear about lead and water and we hear about environmental issues and we hear about all the things and it feels overwhelming. So like what can individual donors do to support and be a part of climate justice solutions?
You know, this is, I really wish I could remember where I read this, but it's like the great ocean wisdom of Twitter, that someone said, you know, join a group, like, you know, join a group, you know, be a part of some group that is organizing around this, like, you know, don't try to do it alone. But if you are just funding, then I think, you know, yes, like consider whether you're doing the most powerful funding you can do. Feel free to look for guidance other places. We do have on the Donors of Color website, I should actually link it for you. I don't know if I can link to everybody in the chat, but you know, on the Donors of Color website, there are 9 regional networks and national networks that meet our criteria.
Yeah.
Okay, I think I can send this to you so everyone can find it. So you can find the organizations that, you know, like if you're curious, you know, where do these organizations exist in the world, you can find what they are here. And there are many others. You know, we didn't try to go to individual groups because we didn't have the capacity to do that, but it's a place that you can begin, you know, finding folks who can move. Even very large amounts of money can move to almost any of the organizations that we listed here. And they were vetted and approved by our movement leader allies. And yeah, and then don't keep doing exactly what you were doing. You know, like have some.
My next question is like, and what else do you need to tell them? What else do they need to know?
Don't keep doing exactly what you were doing. You know, we are all facing this crisis together. Like we have to get it right together. And one thing we know 1000% for sure is that what we have done till now has not gotten us there. And we're not on a fast enough track. We're not remotely on a fast enough track. And, you know, one of the things that I've been asked a couple of times in press interviews is, you know, like, well, why would I not just move more of my money to the big green groups like Sierra Club or League of Conservation Voters? Great. Like they are great groups. Somebody should fund them. Like I support them. They cannot get this done by themselves.
Yeah.
They can't. If they could, they would have done it already. So we have to actually resource the groups that haven't been there. We have to scale the, you know, the voices of the communities that are most impacted. And that's what's going to get us to bolder action than we have gotten to so far.
Yeah, and my one thing about supporting the 1.3% of recipients to this moment is like, look at all they've accomplished with so little. Like if you're worried about your return on investment, like let me tell you about exponential returns. Like this is where it begins, like where it ends. All right, so we're just about out of time. Thank you, Ashindi. I always love talking to you. Thank you for being here today and sharing your wisdom with our audience. For those of you who want to learn more about Donors of Color Network, you can visit donorsofcolor.org. For more donor resources, visit givingcompass.org and check out the Giving Compass's climate justice page, highlighting key information, organizations, resources, and more. Thank you all so much. Wishing you a wonderful day, and we'll talk to you soon. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Afi. Bye.
Bye.